Hi, I'm Nick Malowick, and welcome to An Evil Mind, a crime vlog from Xenobooks. This week, we're going to talk about Andrew Vachss up here above my right shoulder with the eye patch, and the author of, at this point, 30-odd books, I believe, at least. Three major series. Mainly the Burke books, which is one of which we'll be talking about later today. Also books about a former mercenary and a former nurse with Doctors Without Borders. That's the Del and Dolly series. Another book about a group of criminal mercenaries in Chicago, the Cross novels. But aside from that, there's all the standalone books, such as Two Trains Running, and Shella, and That's How I Roll, and The Wait, and Haiku, and many, many others. Across the board, you can't go wrong. Grab any of them, start, in the series, start early. As far as the Burke books go, I think really the first 10 years worth, they're all good, but the first 10 years worth, that's the cream. Andrew Vachss himself is an attorney, former labor organizer, former volunteer during the Biafran War in the early 1970s in Africa, and also ran a prison for youthful offenders. But he's been an attorney in private practice since the 1970s. In his practice, he exclusively represents children. And that's the idea behind all of these books. All of his books, admittedly by him, are meant to get across to people, his chosen messages about child abuse, about child neglect, and not merely specifically sexual abuse, but also emotional and verbal and obviously physical abuse. He chooses to explore these issues in fiction because he believes, that's going to reach a greater number of people than nonfiction would. And I'm afraid I would probably have to agree. Like I said, his longest series is the Burke books, and Burke is the protagonist's sole name, and it's not an authorial affectation like Spencer only has one name. Burke literally has no first name. He has an extensive number of aliases, but on his birth certificate it reads merely Baby Boy Burke. And he was abandoned by his mother at birth. She fled the hospital in which he was born. He goes into the state foster system. There, Burke suffers, I guess a pretty good word is unending amount of sexual abuse. Later finds his way into youth gangs in 1950s New York. After that, does 2 stints in prison. Himself works as a mercenary in Africa. And the important thing to remember about Burke is, he's an unlicensed private investigator, but he is not, and Vachss is always very explicit about this, not a vigilante, not a hitman. Burke is himself, he is a man for hire. Above all else, he is a thief, he is a hijacker, he is a grifter when need be. But you can hire him for just about anything criminal, short of murder, short of drug trafficking, and obviously short of anything having to do with human trafficking or prostitution or the exploitation of children. The problem is that being a criminal, Burke is constantly brought into contact with people who exploit children, people who exploit women, who exploit society's vulnerable in any way. And this triggers an instinct toward vengeance that Burke has. Burke is always trying to get even with the type of people who hurt him as a child. And like I said, due to his profession, he runs up against those a lot and becomes involved with them in some way. And that's the axis on which all of the books turn. The book we're going to talk about today, it was a tough choice for me. Remember, as far as these vlogs go, these opinions are solely my own. These choices are solely my own, and whatever views I express here are owned by me. And also, we're not necessarily, it's a survey. It's not in depth. I mean, I'm usually running about 10 to 15 minutes on these things. So and I'm also not even necessarily talking about the best book in this series. I'm usually talking about my favorite book. If you look over here to my left, that's the hardback for Flood, which was Vachss's first published novel. It was not his first actual novel. That was a book called A Bomb Built in Hell, which was about a hitman named Wesley who figures into the later books. He shows up in the Burke books, in the Burke series. Behind my right shoulder is the final book in the Burke series, Another Life. The one I want to talk about today is not even the best place, I think, to start. It's very early. The third book is the one I want to talk about, Blue Bell. But I think if you want to start with a series, you can start with Flood, although Vachss himself admits that it has a lot of problems. He's been quoted as saying he threw everything but the kitchen sink into this book because he was never sure that he was going to publish another novel. And I think that's one of Flood's weaknesses. I think if you wanted to start with the earliest book, I think start with Strega, which is the second book in the series. I think Blue Bell is a better book than Strega. And in Blue Bell, Burke is hired by an association of pimps to take a vehicle known as the Ghost Van off the street. And what the Ghost Van is a van that runs around New York's prostitution areas and occasionally either kidnaps women or merely someone just throws open the door on one of the vans and these women are killed with a high-powered rifle right there in the street where they're standing. In the course of this, Burke is assisted by a woman who is both a stripper and a getaway driver, the titular Belle. And I don't want to go too far into the story because there's a lot that is going to ruin it. But what I will say is, the Burke books usually end tragically, and this one is no exception, without going into any greater detail than that. Blue Bell also has one of the series' best bad guys in it, who is a martial arts freak who calls himself Morte. And he's grotesque, frankly, very effective. I mean, as a figure of pure sociopathic, sadistic evil, Morte doesn't have a heck of a lot of equals either within the Burke books themselves or crime fiction in general. And that's, one of the things about the Burke books that I can't stress enough. They're very bleak. They're very dark. They are the antithesis of a series like the Spencer novels. The Burke books are, in a certain manner of speaking, hangout novels. Because Burke collects around himself what he calls a family of choice. And that includes, a substitute father, the Prof, who was his mentor in his first prison stretch. He has brothers, of course not biological, but there is Max, who is a deaf-mute Mongolian martial artist. There is the Mole, who is a Jewish, and by his namesake, nearly blind genius scientist and engineer. And also, of course, there he has his sister, Michelle, who is a transgender prostitute when we first meet her in the series. And eventually stops being a prostitute. And then there's many other, he has, younger brothers, Clarence, a Jamaican gunman. He has, a nephew, Terry, who is a former child prostitute who is adopted by the Mole and Michelle. He aggregates his family around him, and this arrangement has been called by at least one reviewer a version of urban sword and sorcery. There is a very heightened aspect to all the Burke books. Some of these things, some of the Mole's inventions verge on science fiction. There is often a supernatural aspect to many of the books, which you don't see in crime fiction a lot. Really, off the top of my head, the only other series I can think about that mixes, or real world type private eye stuff and mysticism to this extent, and even science fiction to a greater extent, would be George Chesborough's Mongol books. So you're not in for your normal sort of private eye books on these. They are very special. They are unique, almost, in the genre, and like I said, all worth reading. You can't go wrong. But so, Blue Bell is probably my favorite out of the series. But like I said, if you're going to start with Strega, work back Flood. If you like Strega, just go back and read Flood, and you'll see the changes even just between those two books. Like I said, A Bomb Built in Hell was his first novel, went formally unpublished until 2012, but it's available now. Before 2012, you could find it as a PDF floating around on the internet, because Vachss made it available on his website, The Zero, which is at Vachss, VACHSS.com. There also, you're going to find links to the group that he is working with now, which is bring it back up on my screen here. It's kind of a long name. The Legislative Drafting Institute for Child Protection. There will be a link to donate to this organization, and what they're a nonprofit that drafts laws regarding the protection of children, hopefully at a national level, because unfortunately a lot of state laws have loopholes, some that provide for example, lesser penalties. If a parent rapes their own child, they get less jail time for doing that than they would get for if they rape someone else's child. They're dedicated to things like that. They also want to make sure that every child who is involved in a criminal case of custody due to neglect or abuse, has a lawyer. The defendant in these cases, obviously, as we all know, gets a lawyer if they from the state, if they can't afford one. The child against whom the offense was committed does not get a lawyer, and that's also one of the things that this organization wants to get laws passed to provide for, because that varies wildly state by state. But there will be links for that down in the description, as well as the normal sales links for the books and that sort of thing. So I want to wrap this up, keep this one relatively short, especially after last week. Want to thank everyone for watching, and again, hope you read the books, hope you enjoy them, hope you buy them, hope these books go to pay for a lot of Andrew Vachss's work, and that's another reason he wrote them, is to provide for a source of funding for his actions. Obviously my books are for sale down there too, other things from Xenobooks. So I will see you next week. I am not actually entirely sure at this point who I'm going to next or what I'm going to talk about next. I actually kind of need to work this out. I've only mapped up to about here. And like I said, after Ace Atkins last week, Vachss is only my, I think, second living author that I've talked about. But we will see you next week, and thanks again. Follow the page, sign up to be notified. You can follow Xenobooks on social media, obviously Facebook, Twitter, obviously, that sort of thing. And we will see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.